Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. And today, I'm going to start off with an article that is coming out of the United Kingdom, and I believe we're going to start seeing more of these articles. And eventually, the truth will come out, what is happening on the ground in terms of the ongoing war will come to light. So let's get into this article, and again, fairly important to hear this. The West didn't plan for how many weapons Ukraine would use. Now it's running out. Stockpiles of anti-tank weapons, precision-guided missiles, and artillery needed in Ukraine are running low. As the war in Ukraine drags on, NATO nations are struggling to maintain supplies of arms and ammunition to Kiev without emptying their own weapon stores. As NATO leaders meet at a summit in Vilnius, they are expected to discuss Allied arms stockpiles, which are dwindling faster than they can replenish them, faster than NATO nations can replenish them. Ukraine's ammunition use is staggering, with an estimated 2,000 to 7,000 artillery shells fired per day. While it is still a fraction of Russia's use, thought to be 20 to 50,000 per day, the rate is enough to worry NATO officials, who say they never planned for conflicts with such an intense use of artillery systems and massive deployment of tanks and gun rounds. In Afghanistan, for example, the rate was 300 artillery rounds a day. The United States typically produces only 15,000 rounds each month. And remember what I told you in the previous episode about the fact that the United States is also now producing Soviet-era Russian type weapons, 152, 122, 130 millimeter systems, rounds. The sorry state of stockpiles is blamed on decades of underinvestment in defense following the end of the Cold War, resulting in weaker capabilities, lower wartime stockpiles, and poor levels of readiness. In February last year, when the war in Ukraine began, stockpiles for many nations were only about half of what they were supposed to be. But since then, NATO countries have provided more than $7 billion in weaponry to Ukraine. $70 billion. Which is more than France's annual defense budget. Let me say that again. Very, very important to hear this. $70 billion in weaponry, more than France's annual defense budget. Get your head around that for a second. These donations have left European military stocks depleted, with even the United States struggling to replace its weapons donations, which is one key reason why it is now offering cluster bombs to the Ukrainians. Just a few days ago, I discussed that the shipment of those cluster munitions was not to give the Ukrainians a new capability, an enhanced capability. It was a sign that there's a problem. Although most NATO members moved to meet a target of 2% of their gross domestic product on defense and 20% of all defense expenditures on military equipment, this shift has been slow to take effect. A 2014 NATO benchmark to stockpile a month's ammunition for high-intensity combat has still not been met. And some members, like Germany, have supplies for a few days at most. Some members, like Germany, have supplies for a few days at most. NATO has just completed a confidential survey of its military inventories, including its remaining munition stocks. While the results are classified, officials say they need more portable anti-tank weapons, precision-guided missiles, and NATO standard artillery, all of which have proved critical to slowing Russia's invading forces. These include Javelin anti-tank missiles, 155mm shells used in howitzers, HIMARS guided rockets, and ammunition for systems like the Iris-T, Patriot, and Gepard tanks. However, these sophisticated weapon systems can take at least a year to manufacture. NATO's Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, has noted that waiting time for large caliber ammunition has increased from 12 to 28 months. While all 31 NATO members are pushed to raise their overall defense spending, they do not have to spend it on the same weapons. There is a long tradition of cooperation with fellow NATO members that include joint procurement of equipment so that most European countries do not suffer from both costly military overlaps and gaping holes in national capabilities. But wait, I need to comment on that. They are seeing that within the scope of this war because they are having to provide and manufacture systems for the Ukrainians, which are inherently Soviet/Russian-made systems, especially the ammunition for artillery. The tank rounds, the 125mm tank rounds, are different. It is about using current and increased funds most cost-effectively, says Sven Biskop, director of Egmont, Belgium Royal Institute of International Relations. It does not mean that a country gives up certain capabilities, as in, I have a navy and you have an air force. Rather, cooperation allows European armed forces to maintain a wider range of capability. And then Britain on Tuesday gave BAE Systems, the country's biggest defense company, a £280 million order for munitions, which should raise capacity of 155mm artillery ammunition eightfold. The government said it will provide Ukraine with more than 70 combat and logistic vehicles, thousands of rounds of ammunition for Challenger 2 tanks, and £50 million support package for equipment repairs. And that is essentially it. So again, major issues in terms of what's happening on the ground and the ability to continue what is essentially a very high-intensity war. And it appears, at least right now, the Russians are perfectly happy, are perfectly accepting of holding this wall of death and pummeling Ukrainian forces with heavy artillery, long-range missile systems, and aircraft. A lot of this equipment that the Ukrainians get have to be stockpiled in supply depots behind the line of contact, behind the front lines. A lot of that equipment is being destroyed before it even gets to the front line. It's very probable that we could see an actual drastic decrease in the amount of munitions that the Ukrainians are deploying per day or firing per day. Remember, the Russians have the ability to strike at Ukrainian depots, factories that are being built, repaired, or hidden factories. The Ukrainians don't have that capability. Remember, during World War II, the Russians moved many of their factories east of the Ural mountain range. Many of those factories, many Russian factories, in fact, exist hundreds and hundreds of miles east of Moscow. We know that the Russians have drastically increased its defense budget. And we don't even know what that real number is right now. But we do know that in terms of manufacturing in the Russian Federation, it has drastically picked up. And the Russians are being directly supported by the Chinese. Has the United States gone on a war footing? Has the military-industrial complex in the United States converted to a war footing yet? I would say absolutely not. Not even close. Not even close. So at this point, it's very difficult to try to ascertain what the Ukrainians are going to do. Because the status quo has war in perpetuity until essentially the Ukrainians run out of ammunition or manpower. And contrary to what you hear on the mainstream media, you kind of get this narrative that the Ukrainians are simply mowing down hordes of Russians. And that's not what is happening on the ground. The Ukrainians are at a serious disadvantage, especially in terms of air power, because they essentially don't have an air force. The Russians do. And the Russians are adapting to this current conflict. What the Russians are doing now, today, is greatly different than what we observed from the Russian military at the onset of this conflict. The Russians are changing their doctrine and continuing to use existing doctrine very effectively. The Russian defensive capability to stifle this Ukrainian counteroffensive that started on June 4th has been overwhelmingly successful. And I would try and reach out to those who are diehard Ukrainian supporters. And I am neither a Ukrainian supporter nor a Russian supporter. I want the United States away from this conflict, personally. I think the end game is going to be a Russian victory. The Russians are not going away, okay? And here in the West, we tend to play the short game. I keep hearing this narrative. Well, NATO would destroy the Russians in weeks. How do you know that? If the West doesn't have ammunition, if it expends its munitions, I understand that these systems are fantastic, technology-wise. But if they expend them and they don't have any more, what are they going to use? Or God forbid we start shooting GPS satellites out of the sky, which is a capability. And we go back to laser-guided, inertia-guided weapon systems. What happens then? I mean, we haven't even seen the size and scope of how this conflict could evolve, change, and expand. We haven't seen unrestricted sea warfare. We haven't seen attacks on mercantile shipping. None of that. None of that yet. And the current generation that exists here in the world has never seen it. You have to go back to World War II to find unrestricted war against merchant shipping. And to say that we won't be back in that place, that spot, that time, is nonsensical. Yes, the American, the United States Navy is far superior to the Russian Navy. It's far superior to the Chinese Navy, contrary to what the mainstream media says. But they still have a very robust capability to cause a lot of problems, meaning they, the Russians, they, the Chinese. But that's kind of where we're sitting for today. I wanted to get that out there. I wanted to have that discussion again. Ukrainian supporters, this is what it looks like since June 4th. So is it safe to say that the Ukrainian counteroffensive was unsuccessful? Is that going to be announced? Or is it going to continue to be, it's going slower than expected? You tell me. Have a good day.